The interesting thing about this is most of the network disruptions did not happen almost immediately, but during the day, the hours, the days, and the weeks afterwards. So this was more like a rolling hurricane type event than a single incident. The following companies did file FCC outage reports. Just because the company did not file FCC outage report does not mean they stayed up. And first off, I'd like to go over some rumors. 60 Hudson was structurally unsound, as folks saw in Nanog when they finally tracked that back through. That was just a worry. 60 Hudson is fine as far as the structural engineers can tell.
Well, the internet got darn slow, but as far as I can tell, it wasn't harmful.
Yeah, we just changed it.
And the rumors weren't going to the internet, even the White House press person was asking updates of the terrorist buildings that were forming. And so the press...
You turn the feed off. Yeah.
This thing was not a one-day, one-hour event.
Really muffled now.
Yeah. There are still problems in parts of the network, and there are probably still problems
through the end of the year. The normal disruptions continued. So as we go through some of these talks, we're going to try to look at some of the things that had happened, but it's very difficult to tell what happened because a provider decided to upgrade their routers that week, and what happened because something happened due to the events in New York or Pennsylvania or Washington, D.C. There was loss of third-party infrastructure, which makes things kind of difficult because it wasn't my infrastructure that was destroyed, it was the infrastructure I leased from someone who leased from someone who was destroyed. So it's very difficult to get information out of folks about what happened. Operator errors and omissions turned out to be a tremendous problem that week. Several of the things that when you finally track it back to what happened, it turns out someone turned something off or unplugged something or changed something. Although it got blamed on lots of other things. Including the infamous, there was a lot of dust in the air. Yes, there was a lot of dust in the air. Everything I saw blamed on that. Generally, that was just not a primary cause for the problem, but maybe at most a contributing cause to the problem. And actually, the direct damage due to the attack was tremendous in Lower Manhattan, but the internet wasn't a target. So the internet got off pretty well just by accident and by luck. The next talk, I'll go over a little about the data that the matrix.net collected, but I just want to briefly go over this to show you that this is just 1 week, and you can see that from the initial event, which is just after that large spike there were problems coming and going onwards after that point. But overall, the network really wasn't that bad. There's been much worse events in the history of the network. What worked on the internet? The undamaged portions of the network worked. TCP/IP actually worked, proof by demonstration. BGP routing, multicast, the core things. What I found interesting is some technologies that we thought were gone came back to life, like Ricochet. It turns out they brought that back up in New York City, and it worked great. And it turned out that exchange points worked really well. Several of the European networks that were partitioned from the U.S. recovered by using some European exchange points and getting emergency transit or peering or whatever you care to call it from providers across those exchange points. more things that worked, and the reason I know the network probably worked the best is because the spam kept on coming. Murphy was an optimist, no kidding. What didn't work? Complex services in a crisis are complex. Load balancing products from a well-known load balancing vendor turned out to kind of not handle the load and crapped out. And that was one of the reasons why you saw some websites go away and come back later, because they switched to DNS, round robin. Generated web pages were replaced by direct load pages. We had several power failures at various points on the internet in in New York City, and software disk mirroring product seems to have tremendous difficulties recovering from power failures, even though the reason you use that particular software disk mirroring product is in case of power failures. And everyone who uses ISDN out-of-band dial backup, it turns out that in a crisis, in an emergency, the first lines the telephone company restores are analog lines. So there were several cases where people had their equipment up and running, but they couldn't reach it because the control line, their ISDN port that they used to say go, hadn't been restored yet. Security authentication. This was an interesting thing. I wasn't expecting this. Turns out that on some very large networks, the authentication servers are somewhere else in the country. So there were a lot of instances of people being able to connect to POPs and saying, sorry, your username's no good. So the question is it better to have local connectivity even if you can't have national connectivity? And you may need to rethink of how you do authentication servers. Authentication servers are a very big single point of failure, and we need to think about them just like DNS servers and other critical servers. In general, authentication got thrown out the window on a lot of parts of the network. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, several other news sites all did away with their authentication processes. And it turned out that there was a lot of I don't know if there was a lot of social engineering, but there was definitely fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the role of government agents. And it turns out it's kind of difficult to figure out who a government agent is, because I too am an official internet detective. And Earthlink was very kind to give this to me probably about 3 years ago. And it says Internet Detective, Earthlink, 1999. And you can get them on the web. Congestion. It's so crowded no one goes there anymore. Yeah, this is pretty much what we expected. Some things that were a problem. Mailing lists worked, but they were slow. Websites, people figured out how to make them work, but they were definite problems. But in general, there was no backbone capacity problems. The congestion was generally limited to the edges and the end users and the end sites. So attempts to fix congestion in the backbone for emergency purposes may not be the best way to approach this. There were several instances, particularly in the Northeast, where people reported trouble reaching their carrier NOC. The 800 numbers just stopped working. Several ISPs needed to create brand new dial-up lines in New York City. And the one interesting thing is people are valuable. You don't want them to stay around when there's a problem. So call centers were being evacuated in the Northeast by several different carriers. And if your call center is evacuated, who answers the phones? That may have been the reason why several people reported not being able to get through to their upstream or peers. New York City. This is a map from the New York Emergency Services. Basically, this is the area around the World Trade Center. Buildings destroyed, buildings damaged, buildings okay. One thing we found out is the net needs electricity. This was the #1 reason why pieces of the net went down. even more than physical damage to pieces of the net. A lot of fiber was damaged, but we lost more parts of the net due to electrical problems. Batteries don't last a week. Generator failures. An operator turned off the generator to save fuel. It worked, yeah. Switch went bye-bye, yeah. Fuel delivery problems. This is a coordination issue. There was a report of a generator failing, and I believe it was actually due to an issue of maintenance more than anything else. And probably the last thing is the dust in the air. The first three things seem to explain all the failures I saw, and the dust in the air was just confusion. And if you're going to have a backup generator, your equipment, your cooling equipment needs to have backup power also. A lot of folks seem to miss this. If you only have a single circuit and it's destroyed, there's no IP traffic. I don't care what you do with the protocols. IP doesn't recover from one circuit going away. So you have to have more than one circuit. Most end users are still connected by single circuits. And the other redundancy and spare issue is the airlines were shut down for several days. FedEx was not delivering. It turns out a lot of people do not have local spares or even nearby spares. So there was equipment that was not being replaced because FedEx wasn't flying. Diversity and avoidance. How far is far? There was a case of one carrier had a sonnet ring. The primary ring went through World Trade Center Tower 1. The alternate path was through World Trade Center Tower 2. Sonnet can only help you so much. Damage to 140 West, everyone's aware of that. But what was interesting about that is the number of advanced data circuits, ISDN, DSL, tends to be concentrated in very few central offices. And since carriers, although someone probably knows about this, the coordination between carriers, you don't realize that in one case, the backup for a carrier was they had bought service from another carrier, but that other carrier was in the same office. Duct tape solutions. People did some amazing things to recover from this. I mean, Con Ed did a great job. They got generators organized. It took them a week or a few days, but they got fuel trucks routed around generators on the streets. In Europe, I mentioned this earlier, several ISPs are essentially tail circuits off of New York City in Europe. Because they were also connected to some exchange points in Europe, they were able to use like Amsterdam and London to recover by getting full routes from a couple of major carriers. I thought that was really great. It shows that exchange points can actually help at that things. One problem with duct tape solutions is there were lots of offers of assistance, but no way for people to act as a matchmaker between the people who needed the assistance and the people who were offering it. Just a quote from Pascal. My recommendations. Rumors will happen. If you just say, don't say anything, they will still happen because someone will say something. Several folks seem to adapt the policy of just simply lock down, shut down, say nothing. I noticed this on several carriers where they issued an initial, I'm okay, our network has no problems at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock on September 11th. But it wasn't over. They had problems later, and they never updated their webpage. They never gave out information after that point. Government response plans need to include the internet. This seems kind of obvious. If you have backup systems, you really cannot rely on people to be around to start them. Your backup generators have to start automatically. Your servers need to reboot automatically. Your routers need to be configured to reboot automatically. All those little bits and EPROMs and configurations, you need to go through and make sure those things happen, because people don't want to be there. The Nuclear Regulatory Agency, after 3 Mile Island, actually has adopted a black box policy on all the nuclear power plants in the U.S., where they can monitor the nuclear power plants remotely. Plan for customer service during evacuation call centers. Pre-plan access with everyone. A lot of companies have really good plans for themselves, but those plans you need to talk to your building landlord. You need to talk so they don't turn off the emergency generator to save fuel. You need to talk to the authorities. Although in New York City they're kind of busy right now. In general, every emergency management organization I've ever talked to said they are more than happy to talk to anyone. Pre-planned load shedding procedures. If you're running short on fuel and you need to cut back, decide ahead of time what gets turned off first, so you don't turn off your network transport equipment, isolating your building first to save power, and that makes the entire rest of the building kind of redundant or irrelevant. Outside plant network transport equipment needs to be connected to building generators when they exist, not just battery backup. This is why you saw the long, gradual decline in network connectivity in New York City. That was as the batteries were slowly dying in various pieces of plants distributed around New York City. Operators are dangerous. As I mentioned, it seemed like most of the problems I saw, besides the obvious physical destruction due to the attack, were due to operators doing something. They meant well, but in a crisis is not the time to be making these kinds of decisions. Operators were turning things off. They were kicking people off phone lines to leave them free. They were turning off generators, turning off equipment. Operators are a problem. The centralized login, that's the biggest protocol thing I see that we need to address as far as a technical problem. Centralized authentication servers are a problem when your network is partitioned and bad things happen. Emergency service people are starting to use the internet now, and there needs to be a way to restore connectivity even above billing or anything else. As you saw in New York City, Verizon made all the public payphones in Lower Manhattan free local calling. Rather than collecting the revenue, the important thing is to get the network running and getting the connectivity and the communications between the people who need it up and running. Using ISDN for out-of-bound access. If I had sat back and thought about this, I would have thought about it, but I didn't, so I mention it. If you use advanced network services for your out-of-band access, the phone company is still the phone company, and they think analog phone lines. The first thing that gets restored during the crisis is national security, hospitals, police, go to analog phone lines, then advanced network services. Simple services work best in a crisis. If you're going to plan any type of crisis system, the old reliable services seem to be reliable. Diversity. You can't predict everything. New York City spent $60 million securing the World Trade Center. They spent $17 million on their emergency operations center. It was a bunker. It was impervious to everything they thought of. That was one of the first things that went. New York City did not have a backup emergency operations center. Diversity is important, no matter how impervious you think your bunker is. If we have time for questions, or we need to keep moving. Okay.